yesterday's discussion set us up very nicely for our panel today on the evolution of data. We talked a lot about how the growth in the digital economy has yielded a ton of data for us to leverage. And we talked about some of the tools and the technologies that we can use to personalize the experiences that we are creating for our consumers. But in light of recent events, we can't really ignore some of the challenges that we've had with data. And recent events with Facebook, Cambridge Analytica, and the GDPR regulations that are occurring on Friday, we're starting to see some of that darker side. And data has become, in some situations, more of a liability than it has become an asset. And so trust and transparency are becoming incredibly critical to the consumer value equation, making it really difficult for brands and marketers to strike that balance between how do we meet consumer expectations, but also meet their demands of consumer privacy. So my name is Natalie McCaffrey. I'm a strategy director here at iProspect. Very excited to be on the panel today with a great group of diverse panelists. So let's just start by having you introduce yourselves.
Sure. Hello, my name is Drew Ford. I'm on the data science team here at iProspect, and we're in charge of looking holistically and building cross-channel optimization tools and different analyses to make sure the campaigns are as efficient and effective as possible across channels.
I'm Michael Blum. I'm the Chief Legal Officer of Quantcast. Quantcast's mission is to help brands grow in the AI era. My job, I run legal, but I also run privacy. Before Quantcast, I was the chair of the privacy practice at a tech law firm, Fenwick & West. And I also run a couple of other things, corp dev and biz dev and a few other areas.
Good morning, I'm Brent Bouldin. I'm the Vice President of Marketing and Customer Acquisition at Choice Hotels International.
Great, so Brent, I'd love to start with you because you come from a very interesting background in that previously you were with a financial institution where you had a significant amount of first-party data and data available to you. And now in your new role, you have very little data. Can you talk a little bit about your data strategy and how you're evolving it in your new role?
Yeah, it's been a stark contrast for me. I've been at Choice for about 2 months after spending 9 years in banking. And in banking, you're rich with first-party data because everybody comes and signs in and comes multiple times per week. And we had to tread on the line of how much personalization is too much, and how do we leverage this data in a meaningful way without being overly creepy, I guess you could say. And at Choice, we primarily index towards leisure travelers, so we get people once or twice a year. About 18% of our people that come to our site sign in. So in the vast majority of the interactions we have no first-party data. We don't know who we're talking to. And so as we think about how do we be more effective with personalization, we have to look to external partners to talk about things like sign in with Google or sign in with Facebook, where we get a persistent ID that carries through, or partnering with a second-party partner where we can sort of piggyback off of their known data strategy, where they know who the people are, and we can sort of leverage that for our own personalization. But it's certainly a challenge. I would imagine that very few industries outside of banking have as much data. So I'm sure I'm not alone, but I wasn't expecting that walking in. I just hadn't thought about it before.
Sure. So on the other side of that, Michael, from your perspective, as Chief Legal Officer, you obviously sit at the heart of data security and privacy, and I can imagine you've been very busy lately.
Yeah.
Can you share what you are doing at Quantcast to protect consumer data, and what are you doing to help brands and agencies that partner with you feel confident in the use of your data?
Yeah. So we've started with a privacy direction from day one at Quantcast. So it's not often that someone who's the chair of a privacy group at a law firm comes in and then becomes general counsel. So that just sort of tells the Quantcast story, which is privacy by design. So the main thing that we're doing is we do not know who you are or want to know who you are. We built the whole thing around anonymization. So we don't have your name, your face, your email, your friends and contacts. These are all the things that got Facebook and Cambridge Analytica in trouble, right? In addition to nefarious purposes, but the fact that they really do know who you are, and that's what much of the landscape looks like. A great way to protect yourself as an agency and a brand is to use anonymous targeting. That's one thing we do. Another thing that we do is Quantcast tries to take a leadership role for the entire industry. So for years, we've been trying to design self-regulation for the ad industry through the NAI, through the DAA, the IAB, the 4As. We work with these groups and we try to set up the rules for ourselves so that together we can be upstanding, good players in the industry so that we're not regulated from outside by different governments. Now, it looks like right now some of that's changing, but you know, the important thing I think is to take a leadership role and to feel like Quantcast feels like we're responsible for those outcomes, and I think everybody can take a role and feel responsible for those outcomes.
So how can you guys share how you are communicating these types of privacy policies, whether it's GDPR or any upcoming privacy changes to consumers? How are you using that as a way to strengthen your relationship with your consumers? Maybe start with you, Brent, from your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all about the transparency and the full disclosure. You know, we're doing the same thing that everybody's doing with the opt-in and the double opt-in, and you know, it's all based on your IP address. And we've hired a chief privacy officer and sort of have those governance processes in place to make sure that we're not running afoul of those new laws and legislations, and then also planning for the sort of what-if scenarios of what happens when this becomes broader and comes to the United States or rolls out in other places. Do we have processes built that we can deploy so we're not just scrambling at, you know, May 24th, 11 o'clock p.m., trying to get this in place before doomsday hits?
Right. So with GDPR happening this week, there's been a lot of discussions on the fate of third-party data. Some people believe that third-party data is going to become stronger, ultimately leading to more effective marketing, and some people believe there's just going to be a lot less of it. So I'd love to hear your guys' perspective on the fate of that and how you see that impacting your business. Maybe start with you.
Sure.
Yeah.
It's true that we don't know exactly how this is going to play out. I mean, it could take, we won't know on the 25th, and it could take months and quarters to find out as things get litigated, as companies establish their positions. One thing we do know is that we need to team up with one another to make it work for the ecosystem. And the good news is that there are already steps being taken in that direction. So I hope I'm not talking about something people are already aware of, but let me just tell you about the IAB Transparency and Consent Framework. Actually, let me just see, have people heard of this? Show of hands, IAB Transparency and Consent Framework? Okay, great, let me tell you about it. So, you know, the big question is, under GDPR, you need to get consent. Well, you need a legal basis, right? It might be that you have a legitimate interest to use personal data. It might be that you need to get consent. If we each go and get consent separately for ourselves, there will be just a little bit of consent that we can each use, and we won't be able to tell others that are in the process of understanding audiences or serving advertisements. We won't be able to tell them that we've got the consent, so that they can then, you know, help us with measurement or viewability or verification or help serve the ad itself. The IAB, and let me just say, that applies basically to everyone except the Goliaths. The Goliaths will have enough consent, and they will be able to tell the different moving parts of their own organizations that they've got that consent. And that's gonna, you know, that's gonna further establish those walls. What we can do is team up with each other and share information about consent. This is what the IAB Transparency and Consent Framework is. It's something that everyone should go sign up for. It's a piece of cake. It's just a framework. It's just a protocol for saying that, you know, when you as a publisher or as an advertiser offer an opportunity for a consumer to give consent, you send it to this framework, which is centralized with the IAB, technically stored in a decentralized way, but the IAB runs it. And then when anybody else in the string of serving that ad or measuring that audience or measuring the ad's effectiveness needs to do that and wants to know if they have consent to do it, they just ping the IAB framework. So the IAB Transparency and Consent Framework is the way for us all to inform each other that we've got the consent that we need.
So what can brands do to become a part of that? Just as simple as signing up? Like, can you
Yeah,
talk a little bit about the
it's as simple as signing up. It's open source. It's very easy to implement. It's basically, it's just the protocol we're going to use to talk to each other about it. It's a bit string of saying, yes, I've got the consent, or no, I don't.
Do you have an idea of how many brands are already within that framework?
There are several hundred publishers in the framework. I think there are some, last I checked, there were 47 vendors on it. Okay. So it's interesting. The IB released it maybe a couple months ago, and nobody was on it, and nobody was interested, and nobody was talking about it. 3 weeks ago, there were 3, and then 2 weeks ago there were 40, and then 1 week ago there were a couple hundred. So it's gaining traction as now everybody realizes, wow, we need a way to continue operating in the ecosystem together.
So from an agency perspective, Drew, how is the regulations with GDPR and then potentially future regulations going to affect the data that we collect and use on behalf of our clients?
Sure, yeah, and I'll probably address this mostly from a measurement standpoint. So in terms of GDPR, despite it not being in the United States yet, the big publishers, Facebook and Google, are already starting to make those preemptive moves to protect themselves. So within the past month, we've seen Facebook, last week actually, announce that they're going to disallow third-party impression tags on their platform. DCM, on the other hand, for years we've been receiving what's called data transfer files from DCM. And essentially what data transfer files are their log-level files of every impression, click, and activity that we serve, whether they converted or not. And within those files, we traditionally receive the user IDs, so we could stitch together paths of converting and non-converting users. So you can imagine that a lot of maybe third-party attribution providers were using these to build their tools with. If you guys had any of your own attribution tools or any of your own third-party analytics tools, let's say in-house, in your garage, wherever you built them, essentially that's going away in terms of taking it, collecting it, and building your own tech stack on top of it. What they're doing instead is they're pushing us into what's called Ads Data Hub, which is it's inside Google Cloud Platform, and you can build the same kinds of tools, but you could imagine the disruption from a tech stack standpoint of, all right, say I have all my stuff in AWS, and now I need to translate it to Google Cloud Platform. The reason they're doing it, though, it's a good reason. It's because of data privacy issues, right? So Google is a data controller, right? So they're the ones receiving the first-party data, and so that means they're liable for it in terms of how they're using and how we're using that data as well. So they just want to ensure that we're not doing anything nefarious with the data. And also, the other good part that's coming from this is that they're actually giving us more data within these platforms. So within ADH, they're giving us more data that we can stitch together than we had with data transfer files. Facebook, within their platform, they're giving us more data about how users are interacting with our ads in their platform. So we're getting more sophisticated. It's just we're also getting more fragmented. We're getting disparate measurement systems. And I told you that I sit at the holistic piece of it, and it's hard then to measure, right? If the wall gardens are just the walls are getting bigger, it's how do we measure across these different walls? So it's a challenge for me, and it's going to be a challenge for brands of stitching together these user paths again in the future, but it's also good. And the other good thing that's happening too is Google, for instance, we talked yesterday about they're now allowing us to inject first-party M1 type data into their platform for search, right? So they're allowing us to push more of our data into their system. They are taking a little bit of data away from us, but it's all in the name of essentially protecting consumer privacy, which is good, and we're getting more sophisticated. We just need to figure out how do we overcome the fragmented measurement systems.
Sure.
So they're letting you use more data, but they're also requiring that you provide more of your data?
They're not requiring it. They're allowing us to use our first-party data, or like an M1 type platform, in order to be more efficient with our campaigns.
Yeah.
I think when we talk about all this stuff, In some ways, it reminds me of the Y2K conversation where like everybody was panicked about this doomsday thing that was getting ready to happen, and then it just came and went and nothing happened. And I don't know about you, but my email is full of like new privacy policies, and every website I go to, I have to click. But I mean, it reminds me like these companies had terms and conditions before about what they were using your data for. You just didn't read them. You just clicked OK. And so now, like, you're just doing that again. You're like recertifying that you're OK with them using your data. But, in some ways, I just wonder, is anything really going to change? Sure.
So one of the many reasons why we're seeing these shifts in data privacy and security is because of this constant tension that consumers feel between privacy and relevancy. And you sort of touched on this earlier, Brent, but I'd love for you just to expand a little bit more on how you determine what is too far and what is too much when you're communicating with consumers.
Yeah, I think I was talking earlier about in banking, you have a ton of information on people about what they spend money on and how much money they make on their paychecks and all this stuff. And the expectation is that you demonstrate that you know them, but don't demonstrate that you know them too well, because they don't want you to over-personalize it. And so I think it comes back down to personal and meaningful, but not sensitive, I remember the article I read a few years ago that talked about as you think about personalization, think about it in the framework of if this was a human interaction. And you can imagine yourself browsing in a store and the clerk walks up and says, if you like that product, you might also like this other product over here. And that would be helpful and totally expected. But if the clerk walked up and say, hey, I noticed you were talking to your wife on the phone on the walk-in, and if you guys are having a fight, here's a good book on conflict, that would be too much. And so, that's a good example. It's also a good example of, on Facebook, I'm sure we've all gotten these ads in stream that are like, keep calm and let Brent handle it. Or, they personalize it with your name. And so you're like, oh, that's pretty cool. But I've also gotten ones that are like, it's a bald guy thing. You would, and I'm like, that's not cool. So that's, I fully realize I'm bald, but I don't want to be targeted on that. So, there's a line there that's just a bridge too far.
Sure.
Yeah.
Michael, do you have a take on that? Like, how do you guys see Quantcast? Like, how do you determine what is too far?
What's too far? Yeah. Well, like I mentioned, one of the things we focus on is anonymity. Other things are transparency and choice. So I like what you're saying here, Brent. I mean, consumers should be aware of and understand the basics of what's happening in the ad ecosystem and have choices and be able to make decisions about it. And that's really a question of education. Right now, the way that we're communicating with consumers is we're sending them these complex privacy policies that they're not reading, and they haven't been too happy about it. And whatever it is we've been doing, a combination of probably a balance between how really relevant is the information we're putting in front of them versus how creepy do they feel it is that what's going on, or how little do they understand what's going on. Whatever it is has gotten us to this point where we're talking about regulation, and in the EU where we've got regulation. I think that's because we've done a horrible job explaining this and educating around it. We're in this room because we believe in what we're doing. We believe that we are getting better information in front of consumers. We believe that we are funding the entire web. This broad, vast, beautiful, free web is from what we are doing here. We believe that we're helping brands grow, and this is a valid and noble pursuit. And if you ask a consumer, they'll tell you, "Oh, I hate advertising." We're supposed to be the ones who are great at telling stories and persuading. We have not gone out and told our story and persuaded. Quantcast tries to do a little bit of that, but I would love to see the industry, from the creatives and the messaging all the way through, get together and give ourselves a little boost so that we don't see further regulation, so that we don't see what we're trying to do hampered. And also, if I can just say something, Brent, you had a point about, so is anything going to change? Well, here's what's already changed right this minute. Google won't they won't let you use the ad server. They won't let you buy inventory on their exchange unless you demonstrate to Google, this is their current position, unless you demonstrate to Google that you have consent for yourself and Google. Okay, so that is happening, and that's a huge deal. We're trying to get Google into the IAB transparency and consent framework, so we can all share consent and share information about this. For what I think are competitive reasons, their play of the privacy card is no. You have to show us you have consent, and you have to get consent for Google. And if you don't, we will just fill that inventory with our own other products.
But isn't that ultimately just one more pop-up on your screen when you of the junk you're not going to read and hit OK?
From a consumer perspective, it might be all the same, and that might be because they don't care, of course, who's serving the ad. But I think a lot of people in this room probably do care about that.
Yeah. I mean, I think ultimately it's not about the fact that data is being used to inform advertising. I think everyone has come to expect that. I saw a survey recently that said 75% of people think personalized advertising is creepy, but only 9% of people are willing to do anything about it. I think that where it gets too far, and we talked about this some yesterday, is things like, you may have seen the Alexa case where they were submitting evidence from what Alexa had recorded in a murder trial. And the fact of the matter was this thing is always on, and it's listening and being stored in the cloud and retained. And it ultimately didn't get convicted. But the fact that that's happening, I don't know that that's transparent to people. You have companies like Ghostery that is an ad blocking tool, and everybody signs up for ad blocking because they hate ads. And oh, by the way, on the back end, Ghostery is selling the data about your ad blocking to advertisers so they can design ads that evade ad blocking. And I think that's not transparent, and that's where it goes off the rails a little.
Brent, Alexa tells me she's not happy that you're talking about it.
Yeah, wouldn't surprise me. But I think that's the thing, right? I think it's the clear and transparent guidelines about what data is being used, who's using it, and how long it's being retained. That might be where this pivots to. But I don't think this is the end of data-informed advertising.
I think to build on that a little bit, we also need to be more transparent about what data we're actually collecting, right? So what's interesting to me about GDPR, if you read through all the different regulations, you have to be transparent about, all right, this is exactly how I'm planning on using this data, and you have to keep a ledger of how you use the data over time, right? And I was explaining this to Natalie yesterday, so allow me to nerd out for a second, but my background's in statistics. Statistics as a field started with the sciences, right? It started as a field where we want to take 24 data points because we're doing all the math by hand, and we want to extrapolate that out to 1 million people, right? Then big data happened, big boom, right? And now what we're doing is we're taking 24 million data points and we're trying to contract that down to an individual, one person, right? So it's sort of like a paradigm shift, flipping statistics on its head. But what we're doing is we're throwing everything in the kitchen sink into a model now from a modeling perspective. And there's a really, really low, or really high, noise to signal ratio when we're talking about data. So we're talking about building machine learning models, for instance, right? And we're only using, in those models, we're probably only using 5% of the data. The rest of it's just complete noise. And when you're talking about statistics, for instance, what's happening is it's called p-hacking. For anyone that's familiar with it, it's called p-value hacking, where essentially I'm going to throw all of my data into a model and see what sticks. And the chance of just finding a random pattern in the data that we find statistically significant goes up significantly with the size of data sets we have. So there needs to be almost a return to the scientific method of, I have a hypothesis, I'm going to go out and I'm going to collect some data to either verify or throw away that hypothesis, and I'm going to run my model on it. And I think when we start doing that, we start thinking more about the data that we're collecting and the data that we're using, and we don't just say, all right, I'm just going to try to grab everything and throw it into a model.
The challenge with that is that, at least in the places I've been, the model, you don't know ahead of time what's predictive, right? So, you're building these in-house models and let's put everything we have in there and we'll determine what's predictive, and then that'll inform what we collect going forward. And it's just sort of this always on, maybe there's something more predictive. And so then you start collecting the data again, you know what I mean?
But I think that's kind of the point, though. It's we don't know what's working, so we're just throwing everything in it. And that's not how science was built, right? Science was built with a hypothesis, like a specific theory that I want to either validate or invalidate. So like,
but that's why we're marketers.
We just have to be smarter, right?
I'm kidding. I get that. I get the point.
Can you talk a little bit about how you foresee this impacting our measurement? I know you sort of touched on it earlier, Drew, but just expand a little bit on how you think these new regulations and the shift to greater data privacy will affect the data that we're measuring.
Sure. So we started talking about like the fragmented measurement space that's happening, right? That's number one. So thinking back 3, 4, 5 years ago, the big buzzword was attribution, right? Everyone wanted to start talking about digital marketing attribution and how do we measure touch points and all that good stuff, right? And that's even started going away, for instance, for, in my mind, 3 different reasons. One, it's just hard to set up. Like, there's probably lots of advertisers out there that have stories of like, I've tried 2, 3, 4 different enterprise solutions, spent hundreds of thousands of dollars, and I just like couldn't get my tracking right, and I just couldn't set it up right. Number 2, what we're starting to see is that they do have their attribution system set up, but they just can't leverage them. They don't have the expertise or the analytics in-house experience to know how am I going to use this tool to really impact my decision making. And then the third piece is it's a little bit more nuanced, but I think it's what we're starting to see is disrupting the industry right now is that they were just asking the wrong question all along, right? So like, we have lots of advertisers out there that 90% of their conversions are happening offline, or 50% of my ad spend is in offline media. So when we start talking about digital attribution, like they've tried to create tools that measure that, but they're not really like sufficient. So we're matching offline data, and we're only getting 10% of our offline conversions into an attribution system. Gerd actually had a really interesting slide yesterday where he said, computers answer questions, humans ask the questions. We were just talking about this the other day. Have you guys read the book Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy?
Long time ago.
Or do you have any like nerdy friends that whenever you ask them what the meaning of life is, they say 42, right? So the backstory to that book is that human beings created this computer called DeepThink, where they put in what is the meaning of life, and they let it compute for like 7.5 billion years, whatever. And it came out, and we're all sitting there watching it, and it came out and said 42, right? They're like, what the hell does that mean? And it said, well, you don't know what the question is, right? So you need to build a better computer to ask the right question. And so I think that's kind of what happened with attribution, right? We just started asking the wrong questions. It became a buzzword, so we all just like flocked to it and set it up, but it wasn't really answering our core business KPIs. So what we're starting to see now is what's called unified measurement, which is it's including like survey results, for instance. It's including MMM, and it's combining the top-down and the bottom-up approach to really get a more holistic view of what's happening both online and offline with both media and conversions. And that's, I think, why you're seeing a lot of acquisitions happening in the space right now as well. So for instance, Nielsen last year bought Visual IQ. We know Newstar bought Market Share. So they're really trying to solve this problem of like, how do we integrate the entire business, both online and offline, into a single measurement solution?
Great. And then Brent, like, do you foresee any changes with Choice's measurement strategy and with the impact of all of these things?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, it's a lot of the same things that Drew's talking about with, online attribution. You have issues with it and holes in what it can see and what it can't see. And so, it feels very much like we'll be sort of going to that unified approach where we're having media mix modeling and attribution and trying to sort of stitch together the story rather than just relying on one type of measurement.
Great. Looks like we are out of time, but thank you all so much for your great input. We will be around if you guys have questions afterwards.